The launch window for North Korea's second rocket attempt came to an end this past weekend, but tensions remain as the regime's leader Kim Jong-un has reportedly pledged to, quote, hold hands with his Russian counterpart Vladimir Putin and boost efforts to realizing their shared goal of building a powerful country. So how are pundits explaining the absence of a second rocket attempt by North Korea? How ready is the international community against future acts of North Korean aggression? And how does the standoff between the US as well as its allies and China as well as Russia look to affect efforts to condemn North Korea's violations of UN Security Council resolutions? Welcome to Issues and Insiders. Today we address North Korea's potential future acts of aggression and more. For this, I have Professor Kim Young-jun at the Korea National Defense Academy, Defense University, that is. Professor Kim, it's good to see you again.
Thank you for having me today.
I also have Dr. Bruce Bennett at RAND Corporation live on the line as well. Dr. Bennett, it's a pleasure as well.
Thank you very much.
Dr. Bennett, North Korea has not conducted a second rocket launch despite claiming that it would seek to do so before June 11th. How do you explain this, and what would have been the implications of a second attempt?
Well, if you draw a line from the point where North Korea launched their first rocket to the point where it hits the ground, and then extend that line, what you see is the rocket was off course. It was headed towards Chinese territory. So North Korea's got some fundamental problem with the guidance system on this missile. It's not going in the right direction, and they've got to fix that. And that's not necessarily an easy fix. So I think it's probably a technical problem that North Korea has, which has prevented them from taking another shot because they don't want to shoot at China.
Right, of course not. Professor Kim, in the meantime, there are some pundits who say that North Korea's space initiatives are aimed at advancing its weapons technology. Do you agree?
Yes, absolutely. Already Dr. Bennett pointed out this is not very different from the missile technology. So North Korea, in general, has always multiple purpose, not just single purpose. So this time is having development of missile technology, or at the same time, military intelligence satellite technology. And interestingly, one other reason is that domestic political purpose to achieve as a space great power status, because of now is a very difficult economic situation, and North Korean people want to have a great thing, and Kim Jong-un guarantee by doing this they achieve space great power status as well.
Right, and Dr. Bennett, with regard to North Korea's initial rocket attempt in late May, aside from the technical difficulties that you mentioned, some pundits claim that the failure was owing to its rushed schedule. I mean, in light of South Korea's successful launch, which took place a few days prior. Do you agree?
Oh, certainly. I mean, years ago, Kim Jong-un announced that he wanted to develop a space launch capability that he could then exploit, presumably trying to get the low end of those who want to put satellites into orbit and get that market for internal reputation purposes and for hard currency purposes. Then South Korea goes ahead and launches a successful satellite and a sophisticated satellite with both a large satellite and mini satellites. That's embarrassing for Kim, because sooner or later, some of that information is going to get into North Korea and he's going to be embarrassed. So I think Kim was trying to upstage South Korea. And when it failed, that was even more embarrassing, because that will also eventually get into North Korea. He's got to try and turn this around, but not until he's got it fixed.
Right. And Professor Kim, despite its failure with regard to the space launch, there are reports that North Korea has succeeded in miniaturizing its nuclear warheads, as well as in making its missiles easier to launch and harder to intercept. How worried, Professor Kim, should we be?
Yes, absolutely. This is a very worrying situation. But at the same time, we have to check re-entry capability it also should be checked. And North Korea says focus on now its development, the miniaturization nuclear warhead for the getting tactical nuclear weapons, and also short-range missile capability aiming at the Korean Peninsula. In the past, they developed the more ICBM and strategic nuclear warhead is for more getting negotiation capability with the U.S. So now it's a more dangerous situation because it is more likely use for the crisis scenario, especially for the U.S. forces in Japan, in Korea, also at the time Iraq Army and South Korean people as well.
And staying with these reports, Dr. Bennett, how prepared are we, the international community that is, to deal with such potential aggression by North Korea?
Not all that well prepared. This is something which most of the international community concluded after the Cold War ended, that nuclear weapons were really a problem of the past. A lot of the education of the military went away with regard to that. And nobody really expected that there was going to be the kind of developing nuclear problems there are today. Russia was prepared to enter the New START agreement and put limitations on their nuclear weapons, reduce significantly those weapons. China was holding steady at a few hundred nuclear weapons. And now all of a sudden, Kim Jong-un is threatening the use of weapons. Vladimir Putin is threatening the use of weapons. And China is building a very large number of ICBMs or other theater missiles. This is a really different situation. It's deja vu and not a happy one.
Right. Professor Kim, the UN Security Council has failed to adopt a united front against North Korea's violations of the Council's resolutions in recent times. It's prompted widespread calls, of course, for reform of the Council itself. Do you, Professor Kim, support these calls? And if so, what do you propose?
Yes, the voice of reform for the UN Security Council is a long history, not just this time. Because of the U.S., especially at this stage, the U.S. and China, Russia had a tension and more conflict because of the U.S.-China strategic competition and Russian invasion of Ukraine. So it'll be very difficult for a while to have a consensus on anything, especially including any resolution against North Korea. So that's why the many people argue now is the reform. But the problem is also UN Security Council reform need Chinese and Russian support as well. That's why we have a difficult situation to reform UN Security Council. So you need to take some time for having consensus among a great power on this matter.
Right, and speaking about consensus, Dr. Bennett, the lack of consensus at the UN Security Council also follows allegations by China and Russia that the US and South Korea are raising tensions here in the region by conducting joint military drills. What do you say, Dr. Bennett?
Well, let's take a look at those drills. They're clearly announced as being defensive. They're defensive in character. What's North Korea doing? It's saying it wants to use nuclear weapons against airfields and ports and military facilities in South Korea. That's clearly offensive in character. Who's the problem? The problem is North Korea, and China and Russia refuse to recognize that that's where the problem is. The US and South Korea don't want to conquer North Korea. That just doesn't make any sense. And so I think this is a case where China and Russia are playing politics. And it raises the question of, do we need a change in the Security Council which removes the veto power of the big five countries? It's an interesting question to consider.
And what are your thoughts regarding that, Dr. Bennett?
Well, I think my initial reaction would be that we need to take a look at the history and see where not having a veto power for the United States would have been dangerous. I'm not a UN scholar, but I think we have scholars who could look at that and decide, are we really in a position where a majority vote of the Security Council would work in the future? Would it have worked in the past? And consider that as a possibility. The world doesn't need to have the developing threat that China and Russia are allowing to develop.
Right. Professor Kim, South Korea recently secured a 2-year term as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, starting, of course, next year. Now, some believe this status itself will provide South Korea with more opportunity to promote its regional security concerns, while others say the membership will require South Korea to focus on broader issues of global interest. What is your outlook?
Yes, now the Republic of Korea is getting more global people state status, especially these non-permanent members of the United Security Council means an important signal. So yes, we have to both the regional impacts on the regional security and peace, and also at the same time we have to beyond the only Korean Peninsula problem. So we have to be a middle power, and now it's a rich advanced nation. We need to have a more voice and a positive influence on world matter as a global people state.
And staying with that, Dr. Bennett, do you believe that South Korea perhaps is punching below its weight with regard to broader global challenges?
Well, I think South Korea faces the concern that with military forces, it's very hard to take much away from Korea because of the threat that North Korea poses. And if South Korea is not prepared to send major military deployments around the world, that's a limitation. That doesn't mean that South Korea has been constrained on the political or economic regard. You look at South Korea, for example, assisting Poland with military technology, providing equipment to Poland. You look at South Korea in many other ways, dealing economically in the world with computer chips, cell phones, and so forth. I think South Korea is taking a major role. It's just on the military side, the North Korean threat constrains its ability to play a larger role.
Right. Professor Kim, the UN administration recently unveiled its security strategy with priority placed on national stability and regional prosperity. How does the UN administration's new strategy compare to that of the previous administrations here in the country?
Yes, previous administration largely focused on the Korean Peninsula peace process, and UN administration security strategy clearly show the role of the global people state, not just a Korean Peninsula problem, but as a leader of a global order. There's a positive impact on the world stage. But not forget about the North Korea problem. So they include the audacious initiative on North Korea issue, as well as the Indo-Pacific strategy recently in showing Korea's contribution as an Indo-Pacific nation. So the UN administration focuses just beyond the Korean Peninsula issue and becoming a more advanced nation as a member of a global leader group.
Meanwhile, Dr. Bennett, back on North Korea, the regime recently was elected to the executive board, that is, of the World Health Organization. Now, amid concerns over this election itself, some observers believe such manner of engagement, if I may, between North Korea and the international community is better than none at all. What are your thoughts?
I think we need to have kind of a mixed bag here. On the one hand, North Korea violates UN Security Council resolutions continuously, 100 or so times last year with its missile launches, none of which are allowed under the UN Security Council resolutions. That makes North Korea a rogue state. So we then have to ask, are we happy with a rogue state being on the World Health Organization board or in other positions? That's really hard to judge. I mean, their human rights activities and so forth are problematic. So we need to take a realistic view there and say, North Korea probably shouldn't be in those positions, but it's very hard with China and Russia supporting them to prevent them from getting that recognition. The U.S. is prepared to talk with North Korea any day. We've made it very clear. Any day, anywhere, we'll meet with you. This is not a U.S. problem. This is a North Korea problem.
Right. The allies, including South Korea, of course, have made it very clear that the door to dialogue remains open. And that being said, Professor Kim, with the exception of its purported space initiative, North Korea has not engaged in any missile provocations in recent times. Do you believe deterrence efforts by South Korea and its partners like the US and neighboring Japan are paying off?
Now, the UN administration, also Biden administration, and the Japanese administration developed their security partnership between three countries ever strong now is enough. And ROC-US alliance are strong. And so this is a very impact on the deterrence measure against North Korean activity. Also, North Korea, interestingly, also consider a possibly dialogue with the U.S. After 2024 presidential election. Is the scenario of a Trump back. So North Korea, that's why it's a keep silence as well, because of the open some opportunity with the possible presidency of the Trump second term. And also they want to focus on more Korean Peninsula rather than the U.S. So we need to prepare for the North Korean threat by strengthening the three-country security partnership.
Right, and staying with the threats posed by North Korea, on a rather very grim note, of course, Dr. Bennett, what response do you envision in the case of a nuclear test by North Korea going forward? I mean, do you see some form of unity within the UN Security Council if there is another nuclear test by Pyongyang?
Oh, I think China and Russia have been very clear that if that kind of event occurs, they're not going to support a Security Council resolution against North Korea. So that needs to then go to the U.S., its allies, South Korea, to try to take actions in a multinational approach that's outside the Security Council. And that's not what we would prefer, but that's what China and Russia are forcing. They don't want the UN to be a body that reins in bad behavior like that. And if North Korea does a nuclear test, I think we've got to be very clear with North Korea that that's unacceptable. We need to start thinking, though, about a different way to respond. We've mainly made economic responses thus far. We've gone a long way there. What we need to be thinking about is informational responses. Hey, let's be clear. Kim Jong-un has said that things like K-pop are a vicious cancer which could cause his regime to collapse. So he's told us what he's vulnerable to. Why don't we use information, therefore? That seems to be the opportunity that we're just not exploiting. And I think a response in that way would be potentially very interesting against North Korea.
And staying with that, Professor Kim, this is an impromptu question, but what do you suggest with regard to a possible response to North Korea if we cannot rely on a joint response from the United Nations Security Council?
Yes, easily guessing the China, Russia will never join any kind of UN Security Council resolution, especially that U.S. will lead. So absolutely, I agree with Dr. Bennett's opinion, information warfare capability. Because of during the Cold War, we remember rock and roll music and blue jean made the led collapse of the Soviet Union. So we have a stronger capability on BTS music and K-pop and K-pop opera rather than military deterrence measure in leading collapse of North Korea. So I love to support Dr. Bennett's idea as well.
Right, it is a possible option then. All right then, Professor Kim, as always, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts. And Dr. Bennett, as always, it was a pleasure to have you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, well, that ends this edition of Issues and Insiders. Thank you for watching. See you same time tomorrow, that is Tuesday.